Today we get to find out what happened when you wore the wrong thing to the steward's enclosure. Did they really take that stuff seriously?
And she had a small sort of slit in her skirt, and the security guys made her get a safety pin and pin it up because her knees and a little bit of thigh was visible.
And we'll also find out what happened at the Grand last summer.
At the last minute, literally the day the entries closed, they had a great training outing, and it was the crew decision, it wasn't the coaches. They got together and the crew said, we want to go for the Grand.
That's right. Grab your sun hat. We're going to Henley. Parents, this is rated G. Peter and I agreed to keep it classy so you can listen in your car with the kids. Last fall, I was at my son's regatta and I overheard a fellow parent asking, "What is that race you have to buy that jacket for?" We're going to talk about it today. We're talking to Peter Smith. He wrote a book about Oxford Brookes and the rapid rise to glory and success. His book, called Oxford Brookes, A Rowing Miracle, is top of the list for rowing books on Amazon right now. I totally recommend it if you're interested in rowing lore, Oxford Brookes, or high-performance teams in general. On this podcast, we talk about things you might not know if you don't have family or friends in rowing. And due to the fact that rowing is an international sport, you may find yourself on a team that has the option of going to Henley in England. Peter has been very gracious in agreeing to discuss not just his book, but to give us a little primer on the Henley experience, both as a rower and a spectator. I am a middle-class mom in Seattle, so I have low-key anxiety about class and dress codes. So let's take a side quest for fashion. I'm not sure who needs to hear this, but I know there's another mom or dad out there in Seattle, Texas, Alabama, or Ohio that has been surprised to find your daughter racing internationally. And even more surprised to find that the event is covered by Tatler magazine. Here's the deal. Henley is fun. All regattas should be friendly, chatty, and fun. There are plenty of friendly people at Henley, especially after 2 classes of PIMS. And if you're a US parent, well, you do not have to go to the steward's enclosure to enjoy Henley. There's the regatta enclosure, the banks of the river, and picnics in the car park. And if you went to my high school, you already know how to party in a parking lot. Am I right? But what would I do if I were you? And I really wanted to get in the spirit of Henley. Own it. It's the only option. I would pick up a nice long floral dress for myself and a linen suit for my husband. You can thrift these for cheap. I'd take them to a tailor. If you have the cash, one stop at Nordstrom should do it. If you're in Seattle, I would go to Eclipse Hat Shop on Western in the Pike Place Market. It's not cheap, but Sharon and Diego, they know what they're doing. And because of the grass and champagne combination, wear flats and bring your most fabulous sunglasses. And if you do find yourself invited to the steward's enclosure and you wish to wear trousers, you can now. Georgina Grant petitioned in 2020 to change the dress codes for the steward's enclosure. Phew. Thanks, Georgina. Okay, fashion moment over. For the movie buffs, yes. The Henley Grand is the race featured in the movie The Social Network. Armie Hammer portrayed the Winklevoss twins, also known in the plural as the Winklevi, who rode in that race for Harvard in 2004. According to Tyler Winklevoss, the team called themselves the God Squad because some of them believed in God, some of them believed they were God. As my kids would say, cringe. Hello, Peter. Welcome to the Third Boat podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and for those who have not yet ordered Peter's book, Peter has written a book addressing the history, the very impressive history of Brookes rowing in Oxford in the United Kingdom.
Indeed, and just to stress, Oxford Brookes is a university in its own right now, and it's nothing to do with the Oxford University you see rowing in the boat race against Cambridge University. So that's a mistake even many people in the UK make. They they think Brookes is a college or part of Oxford University. It's not. It's a separate university in the same city, and their boat club has become, at the risk of upsetting some of my friends who went to Oxford University, Brookes has basically become better at rowing than Oxford University or Cambridge University, which is where I went.
Yes, which I have noticed it's been a very strong showing, and of course, out here in Seattle, we're starting to be familiar with Brookes as well, as we saw them at the Windermere Cup
Oh, yes,
in
that's right. Yes,
2018. They did a very good showing. In fact, coming up behind, almost beating Washington on their home course at the
yeah.
last 500. It was impressive.
Yeah, I think Brooks had some excuse as to why they didn't win that. I think they claimed there'd been some small technical issue or whatever.
Sure.
But we might talk about it. There's been some great races between Brooks and Washington at Henley Regatta in the last 2 years, so we might touch on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So could you share a little bit about Henley and the Henley experience? Because we actually are starting to see a few more clubs from Seattle go over and compete in Henley.
Yeah. Well, I maybe if I explain how I got into rowing, because Henley played a part in that as well.
Wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, so I went to a school that didn't row, just a little local school in the north of England, had no interest in rowing, went off to Cambridge and happened to be in the college. There's about 30 colleges within Cambridge, and they compete against each other. And I happened to end up at the college that was the best at rowing at the time. Um, and I signed up to the Learn to Row program. And after a couple of weeks, they said, "You're much too small to be a rower. You need to be a cox." Uh, and I didn't like the sound of that, sort of sitting in the end of the boat, but I gave it a try, and I loved it almost instantly. So I moved up pretty quickly. And by my second year, I was coxing the college first boat, which was the best in Cambridge. And after we were head of the bumps races in the second term, the Lent term. In the final term, we didn't quite make it to head. We started fourth and went to second. But then I said, "Oh, we're going to Henley Regatta." And at that time, most of the better college crews at Cambridge would go off to Henley. And it's the biggest rowing event in the UK. Arguably, I would say the most prestigious rowing event, uh, full regatta, let's say, outside the Olympics and the World Championships. So lots of international entries. And there are, I think, 26 or 27 different events. Um, there's men and women. So I think 17 men and 11 women's events now, juniors, intermediate students, and open events for the top crews. And it's eights, fours, coxless fours, cox fours, quad sculls, single sculls, the whole lot. There's no separate lightweight events, but other than that, it covers most of the boats, and it's head to head racing. So it's knockout. So it's rowed over 6 days now. It was only 4 days when I competed. Um, so the big events you might race every day or 5 of the 6. Obviously, if there's only 8 entries, maybe for a top event, you row 3 days, perhaps Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, um, and it's on a marked out course, but only a single course for two boats. So there's no lanes separating the two boats, which makes life interesting, as we might talk about in the Grand this year when Washington went
Yes.
spectacularly wrong. But we'll come back to that. Um, so it is gladiatorial, if that's the word. Two boats thrashing it out over the traditional Henley length course, which, just to confuse everybody, is 2,112 metres. So all the crews that have trained over 2,000 meters get to the last 112 meters and collapse. Um, but the fascinating thing about Henley is, say, the rowing is top level. The top open events are usually won by international crews, often Olympic gold medal winning crews. Um, but on the bank, the main spectator area, known as the steward's enclosure, um, is almost like a recreation of a 1920s Edwardian British garden party. So we're all there wearing our blazers and ties. Gentlemen must wear ties and keep their jackets on. Big controversy about 3 years ago where ladies were for the first time ever allowed to wear trousers. That had been
Yes,
banned.
I was quite surprised by that. I've visited Henley in '95. I was
Yeah.
living in London, so I've actually seen a few of the men's races at Henley,
Okay.
and
Cool.
so when I heard that ladies were allowed to wear trousers,
Oh,
I was I
it's an
was floored, and of course supportive. Of course supportive,
absolute
but
disgrace. Absolute
yes,
disgrace. Terrible, terrible.
yes.
Um, the, the more, I mean, the other thing is literally, it used to be skirts or dresses had to be below the knee.
Right.
And I remember going with a friend and his wife, and she was a very tall girl. She'd been a high jumper, actually. So she struggled to find anything that came below her knees. And she had a small sort of slit in her skirt. And the security guys made her get a safety pin and pin it up
Oh my goodness.
because her knees and a little bit of thigh was visible. They've become much more relaxed about that. I've noticed some quite exciting split skirts and dresses in the last year. So anyway, moving on from that, the
Yes.
stewards who run the regatta, it's a voluntary thing, and it's a group of about, I think, 40 people, mainly now ex-international oars people, men and women. Um, and it's all voluntary. They don't get paid, and they run the regatta, and they have the stewards enclosure, and there are about, I think, 9,000 members of the stewards. I joined it way back when I was a student, so I've been every year for more than 40 years now. Um, and as a member of the stewards, I get my badge, so I can go every day, and I get a certain number of free tickets, and I can buy more tickets. But the atmosphere on the bank, we're all dressed very nicely. We're enjoying our pims with plenty of ice, or maybe the odd beer or glass of champagne, sitting in the deck chairs, applauding politely, while the brass band plays songs from the musicals and light classics in the background. And meanwhile, the racing we're watching is absolutely top class crews killing each other. So it's
Amazing. Amazing.
quite
Yeah.
what's the word? A dichotomy there. I say we politely applaud. Um, Close races, certainly semi-finals, finals day, get the loudest cheering a rower will ever hear. Honestly, louder than
Mm.
the Olympics, because the spectators are right on top of the course. So I remember
Right.
rowing in the semi-final against Yale in my final year. No, that was my second year. Sorry, and we could have won, maybe should have won. One of the crew was ill that morning. We lost by like a quarter of a length. It was a quarter of a length all the way up the course, and I'll never forget the noise as we came to the stewards' enclosure, because a UK university against an American university, the crowd just going mad, and it felt like, yeah, it felt like being in, I don't know, Super Bowl or something like that in terms of the crowd noise. Um,
Wonderful. And they are all along the race course as well, aren't they? I don't think I've certainly experienced that
yeah, that's
yeah.
really changed in the time I've been going. So when I rode or coxed, it was only really spectators in the last maybe 600 meters, something like that.
Yes.
And as it's become more and more popular, and there's both more corporate hospitality, and also down near the start now, it's like party town. So,
Right.
I mean, literally, there are pop-up nightclubs,
Oh,
and yeah, some of the top London nightclubs come and put up huge tents, and lots of the trendy young people come out from London. They're not really interested in the rowing; they just come for the
right.
party.
Oh my
And
goodness. I wasn't aware of that. Yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, and there's like a fairground and shops and bars, and so yeah, all you don't get the spectators lining the banks and cheering so much near the start.
I see.
But there are people. I mean, in my day, coaches could cycle all the way along the towpath until the final enclosure,
Right.
except maybe on finals day. Whereas now you can barely walk along the towpath; it's just packed every day. So, so yeah,
Right.
so
I mean,
it's a great event. Great event.
yes, and if when I went, and again, this was quite a long time ago, so this was 95, but I do recall that even the car parks or the parking lots were fancy for an American in that I walked, towards the regatta and I got, distracted by a group of gentlemen in a very fancy car eating, and drinking champagne in the car park, and, that was a great way to start the
Well,
spectator experience, but,
again, it's changed a bit over the years. If I go back to like the 1980s and 90s, we would literally see there'd be a Rolls Royce or a Bentley,
yes.
and they'd have a gazebo, an open tent, and they would have their staff who were laying out the tablecloths and the silver service and the cutlery and the crockery while the masters were in watching the rowing, and it was like, yeah, it was like Downton Abbey or something. Now it has changed. You don't see as many. I don't see the staff doing lunch anymore, and the car
Right.
parks are more likely to be ex rowers who are now hedge fund guys and girls, and the cars are Porsche and
Right.
Lamborghini rather than the old Rolls Royce style. But but you still get some very impressive picnics. I mean, we bring our own picnic in the car park, but
Okay.
ours is a bit more modest, let's say.
Yes. Well, things have to change, I suppose, but,
They
I'm
do,
glad to
they
hear that
do.
the picnics are still happening, and,
Yes, yes. We still
yes,
manage a bit of champagne and smoked salmon and so on.
good.
So
So, one of the things that I've also found is interesting about Henley is you can actually be knocked out quite early and then have a few days still ahead of you in the regatta. It's brutal and
yeah,
gladiatorial, like you said.
yeah. It yeah. So I mean, they do seed crews in most of the events to try and
Mhm.
avoid Brooks coming up against Washington in the first round, let's say.
Right.
Um, but they don't always get that right. You can find perhaps an American university that the stewards don't know a lot about, or a crew from, I mean, the crews from Japan, Australia, all over the place, and sometimes they just misjudge it. Um, and actually, this year in the top women's event, the Open Eights event, Remenham, um, I mean, they knew the top Brooks women's crew was good, but they didn't
Right.
seed them. They didn't think they were quite that good, and they seeded crews from America, Canada, Germany. The German crew was supposed to be really good and got
Mhm.
knocked out in the first round. Um, and Brooks, who were unseeded, went all the way through and won. So, so
Spectacular, yes.
yeah. So I mean, if you'd been supposedly the top crew in that event, and you'd drawn Brooks in the first round, you were going home on Thursday.
Oh
So
my.
and I mean, going back again to my day, my my college second crew, the event for student eights, you're only allowed one entry per club, or you were in those days anyway. Actually, it has changed now, but in those days you could only have one entry. So our college second boat had to enter a higher level event that was mainly clubs, and some very good clubs, and they were drawn in the first round against the GB national lightweight squad,
Oh my.
who probably should have been rowing in the Grand in the top event, to be quite honest. So it's my college second boat full of 19-year-olds against probably the fastest lightweight crew in the world at the time. Um, and yes, that was quite amusing because we were they have a commentary up in the spectator enclosures. I mean, they now have video; they didn't in those days, so it was just commentary. So you get this terribly, terribly, English voice saying, And the next race has started between the GB National Lightweight 8 and Lady Margaret Boat Club Cambridge Second 8. And you go, and at the end of the island, which is about the first 30 strokes, at the end of the island, the crews are level. And we go, oh my goodness, what? There's no. And he goes, then, and at the quarter mile, the crews are still level. And we're thinking, oh gosh, this is a huge shock. And then there's a sort of minute silence, and they get to the first sort of big marker point, the barrier, which is 2 minutes into the race.
Mhm.
And at the barrier, the lightweights have a substantial lead. And
Oh,
and basically, my friends had just said, right, we're going to go absolutely flat out for the first minute. you know,
right.
pretend we're doing a 250 on the erg, and see how long we can hang on to them, and just for a bit of fun, and that's what
Just
they did. So, yeah.
very
But yes,
honorable. Yeah.
you can literally you can fly halfway around the world, have one race. Um, in fact, now it's so popular they have a qualifying race in quite a lot of events. So you have to do a time trial on the Saturday before the regatta to
Mm.
get into the full regatta if you're in an oversubscribed event. So we have seen crews that have come in from different countries, and they don't even get through qualifying, which is very sad.
Oh
But,
my. Yes, that's a lot of resources. It's not a
yeah,
cheap thing to send a crew over there.
no,
Yeah, it is a gamble to go to Henley. It's
yeah, yeah,
a great
and
expense.
and I think that like the standard of British school rowing has
Yes.
really gone up in the last 10 years or so. So it used to be the Australian, US schools crews did very well, but
Mhm,
actually, in
mhm,
more recent years, St Paul's and Westminster and Radley and Eton have
mhm.
most years they've beaten the non-UK rivals. So
Right.
yeah,
And in fact, that's probably a good segue point for us because I had not been paying a great deal of attention, except as a fan, of course, to the rowing world until my son became involved. And as I looked in a little more detail at the current culture, quite a lot of your boys are coming over and rowing on our dime here. So, and in fact, what I thought was quite funny is, there were Europeans wearing boys in the boat uniforms and racing in regattas. I thought that was
yeah,
actually kind of funny, kind of cosplaying there. But
yeah,
did
yeah,
you want to explain that to me?
yeah.
Why are
Well,
we seeing so many of them?
yeah, and I mean, this goes back to the success of Brookes. That plays into it because um, Brookes wasn't a university till 30 years ago. It's what we called a polytechnic, like a college,
Right.
not quite university level. And in
Mm.
the early 90s, a lot of those polytechnics converted to being universities. So we call them the new universities. Um, so Brookes only became a university in 92. And they've done well. So they're now, I think they're in the top 50 universities in the UK out of 150 or 200 in total. So they've moved up the league table academically, but they're still, academically, they're not at the level of Oxford,
Right.
Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, probably Washington. Um, and what's happened now is the top schoolboy rowers, most of them are at very good schools that also happen to be very good academically. So St
Hmm.
Paul's,
Yes.
best rowing school for the last 10 years, probably, if you worked it out, and one of the top 3 or 4 academic schools in the country. Eton, very good school academically, very good at rowing. Um, but there are lots of other uh, private schools, and indeed some government state schools that row, and also kids who learn to row in clubs. So what we're seeing happening now is the best schoolboy and schoolgirl rowers, if they're at one of those top schools, which means they're probably academically gifted as well, um, they're actually smart enough to get into Harvard, Yale, Washington, Berkeley,
Right. Berkeley,
um,
yeah. Hmm.
yeah, and probably smart enough to get academic scholarships. But they also happen to be really good athletes as well. Um, so I think because maybe we have that sort of correlation between academic standards in schools and rowing strength. there's this flow of kids from St Paul's and St Paul's Girls and Headington Girls' Schools and Girls' School in Radley. Shiplake is another one that was just boys until a few years ago, and now
Right.
they started taking girls a few years ago, and they got really good girls' crews as well. Um, so they're great candidates for the top American universities because they're really bright kids as well as being great athletes. Now, what Brookes has been really good at is taking maybe the youngsters who perhaps academically not quite up to Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale. I mean, they're still bright, um, and offering them as good or better rowing experience as they would get at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale. Um,
Right.
they can still get a good degree. They come out with a Brookes degree, which is valued. And Brookes is really good academically at certain subjects, anything to do
Mhm.
with property, estate management, law, architecture, things like that. Um, and so they're picking up kids from maybe not the very top private schools and state schools and clubs who aren't going to go to Harvard or Yale, but want to go somewhere that they're going to win events at Henley and go on potentially into the GB squad and win Olympic medals, which is what's happening now. We're seeing Brooks people going through that journey, and winning at the Olympics this year. So yeah,
Oh,
and
it's
and
wonderful.
it's mainly been men, but it's going to start being the women as well because Brooks has really developed their women's program the last sort of 6-7 years or so. So actually, the World Under 23 Championships this summer, they had, I think there were 9 Brooks gold medal winners, and I think it was 5 men and 4 women. So they're 4 women. 2 of them went into the 8 and 2 into the 4, and both those boats won gold medals. And actually, the women's coxless 4, I think, broke the world under 23 record in
Oh,
winning the gold,
impressive.
and that had 2 Brooks girls in it. Um, and Brooks is also picking up when some of these athletes who they do their degree in the US, and then they come back and they want to row. They're maybe not ready to go straight into the national squad. They come
Mhm.
back and row with Brooks, so maybe they'll do a master's degree at Brooks. Or they do have a few people at Brooks who aren't actually studying, who are part of the sort of national development squad. Um, they have a handful of people doing that.
Yes, I
But
think
yeah.
we've had some Washington folks go over. I think, one of, the rowers that I think I have a soft spot for just because he's from Northern Seattle, I think Evan Olson.
Oh, he
Yes, he
rowed at
was
Brooks. Yeah, yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes. So, because
yeah.
NCAA rules are that you can only row for so many years in
That's
the
right. Yeah,
States, and then you can proceed on with a degree, in England and continue to row
yeah,
and work on that. So thank you for helping our boys out too, I guess.
yeah. But it's quite funny when I see the University of Washington crew this year, and it was like four British athletes and only one US athlete. And I think it was either Harvard or Yale this year. It was even more, wasn't it? It was, I think, 5 or 6 Brits in the crew. It was in the
Yes.
top varsity crew. It was crazy.
Yes,
But
that's right. And, I watched, the boys race between Green Lake and Ship Lake, at Henley, and
yeah,
they Ship Lake is very strong.
yeah,
I can really see why they would be recruited over here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Although historically, interestingly, Shiplake didn't used to be such an academic school. It was where the sons of people who were in the British Navy went.
Oh,
I mean, senior naval officers. That was the Shiplake sort of cohort tended to be of that nature. But the last few years, Shiplake's really developed, and it's become more academic. It's gone mixed with girls as well, but it's still maintained its really good sort of sporting ethos as well. So
mhm, mhm.
yeah, some of my daughter's friends went to Shiplake. So
Oh,
yeah,
wonderful. Very
yeah,
strong. Yes. Yes.
yeah.
And so we're seeing, yes, international rowers, which had actually only just started, when I was in Washington. Uh, I remember some coming over in '91
Okay.
from from Italy, and on the women's team, they recruited from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then, increasing from then thereon. So,
yeah. Well, it was interesting this year. The top Brooks boat that won the men's open event at Henley. Um, that had one Dutch guy in it, but all the rest were Brits. The
mhm.
top women's boat that won the Remenham actually had two Canadians
Oh, mhm,
and one Irish young woman who was I think an international level Irish sculler. So probably, I mean, a lightweight, not a big
mhm.
athlete. Um, but that women's boat was very impressive. But I don't know. I mean, obviously their recruitment is good. But what impressed me with Brooks is they seem to be able to take athletes who were very good, clearly, really, really good rowers already, but maybe not seen as the absolute best.
Right.
And a year or two at Brooks, then they're the best. So the one Dutch guy who rode with them last year, he's doing a medical degree, so he came to do 1 year of his medical thing in Oxford rather than in Holland. Um, but I think he hadn't made it into the Dutch under-23 boat or something
Right.
like that. So he rode with Brooks this year, and 6 weeks before the Olympics, they sent a lot of boats to the Dutch national regatta,
Oh,
uh,
mhm,
and Brooks beat the Dutch national eight 2 days running. So they got a guy who didn't make the Dutch under-23s, but they put him in a
right.
Brooks boat in 6 months of training, and he's beating his national compatriots. And
Oh my
that,
goodness.
that Dutch boat 6 weeks later won the silver medal at the Olympics.
So what is the secret sauce? Of course, I'm gonna ask that. Do you feel that you
Well, I think I'm not sure there's like a super technical answer to that. I think
Mhm,
Brooks uses telemetry really well,
right,
which is the you'll know this, but the really clever electronics that you sort of stick something on the blade and it can tell you everything about how much power the rower's getting each stroke, the sort of trajectory of the stroke, how the power varies through the race, the length of the stroke, all those things.
which is
Uh,
amazing because we did not
yeah,
have that when I went to
we did
Brooks.
not even dream of that in my day.
Yes, yes.
um, and I think Brooks have become brilliant at using that data to work out how to optimize the power through the whole race. Um, and also for each athlete to understand that, because the natural approach of different athletes, some will go out really hard and be half dead by the final 500.
Right.
Some are better at pacing themselves, but that data can really help train the athletes into how to pace themselves as well. um, but I think the psychology is probably even more important with Brooks. I should say,
Mhm.
I mean, physically, they train really hard. I mean, they train really, really hard. They train at international
Right.
level um, of training, and you can't get away from that. But the psychology is great too. And the thing that um, really impressed me was how they combine two things that feel like they're more likely to be opposites. So there's an intense internal competitiveness in the club. So, I mean, last year they had, I think, 8 men's 8s and 5 or 6 women's 8s. So there's a lot of people rowing, and there's a lot of measurement of your performance through the telemetry, through your times in the gym, on the machines, and so on. Um, and what they don't do is they don't sort of set a crew at the beginning of the year or even the term and say, this is like the varsity crew, this is the second boat, this is the third boat. Obviously, they have different boats, but they switch people around almost constantly through the year. Even within individual events, that Dutch regatta I was talking about, there was some sort of Saturday events and some Sunday events. And I was looking at the crew names, and in the women's boats, for instance, there were several women who were in the A boat one day and the B boat the next day, and they were moving people around. And it's experimenting with different crews, or it may be the qualification is different for different events. So, somebody can't row in a certain category in a regatta, so they move somebody else in. Um, So it's really competitive, and you know that if you ease off, if you want to go and have a week where you say, well, I'm not really going to train hard this week. I'm a bit tired. I've had a hard week. I've had a few beers last night.
Right, right,
Um, there's a fair chance next week you'll be in the D boat rather than the C boat.
right,
So that competitiveness is tough, but you'd think that would mean there was a bit of a vicious or a, I don't know, unpleasant spirit in the club. And I didn't see that at all. I saw really great team spirit with everybody pulling together. And I think the way they do it is what they tell the rowers is they say, look, if you're in the fifth boat, well, actually, even in the Brookes fifth boat, you could be winning intermediate events at regattas, so you can win some medals. But next term, you could be in the fourth boat. Next year, you could be in the second, third boat winning events at Henley.
right,
And in your last year, you could be in the GB squad.
right.
So they encourage people to push themselves, but they also say, look, even if you don't progress up the boats, the harder you work, you are pushing the people ahead of you, because the
Yes.
guy or the woman in the boat ahead of you sees you and says, "Oh, Peter's training hard. Gosh, look at how his ergo times have come down. Wow, I've got to pull my finger out and work a bit harder, or he's going to have my seat in the boat." So, by the more junior athletes are pushing the whole club onwards, and that's what you see them when you see quotes from the athletes. Um, or talk to them at Henley after they've won an event, and the whole club sort of gets together to greet the boat coming back into the boathouse and cheers them in. And you talk to one of the more junior ones, and he or she will say, "I'm part of that. I helped that because I'm working hard. I'm pushing them to work hard, and look what we've just done." So it's a really interesting sort of psychological approach to both competitiveness, but also the one, what is it, one for all and all for one. Um,
Right. You know,
you do feel it.
I felt that at Washington, and I had kind of a different experience in that I was at Washington, and then I took a year in Scotland after 2 years of rowing at Washington, to, in theory, get serious about my academic world. And of course, I ended up rowing again. But, but, that was up at Aberdeen. And I
Oh,
think, yeah, scrappy crew. I just loved it. But what was interesting to me is the culture was so completely different because, of course, they don't have paid rowing staff.
right.
And I hadn't realized what a luxury Washington was, because it was the only rowing university in Seattle. And I grew up in Seattle. So my worldview was fairly distorted in terms of rowing. And, and to the point where, uh, the first regatta I was invited to, it just didn't occur to me to bring, a sleeping bag or anything like that because I assumed we would be put up in hotels.
Yes, yes,
So
yeah,
they're all really good sports to give you blankets, and that sort of thing,
yeah,
but,
yeah,
just completely different. And I do think that the, data that you touched on and the kind of honest measuring of progress, I think helped in some ways to create a certain feeling of uh, possibility and promise and meritocracy in Washington
yes,
that sounds
yeah.
like you're kind of speaking to at Brooks. It's like,
I,
well,
absolutely,
this
absolutely.
is your 2K. This is her 2K,
Yeah,
and that's why she's in the first boat. And
yeah, that's it, that's it.
you
And
know,
I think Brooks is also, it's quite funny. They still have some of the sort of underdog spirit.
right?
Which goes back to the 30 years ago when they really were underdogs. Well, it's crazy, really, because they won 13 events in the last 2 years at Henley, which is more than the next, I don't know, 6 universities put together.
Oh my,
Um, so that
yeah,
they're not underdogs anymore, but they they sort of
right.
cultivate that attitude. And to be fair, they have a lot less money than the big US universities, or
Yes,
probably Oxford and Cambridge. They don't tend to have, as yet, rich alumni who are putting in
right,
millions of dollars. So
right.
I was interested how, even compared to my day at my college in Cambridge, um, there's no there's no boatman or boatwoman. There's no
Right.
paid person who repairs boats and cleans the boats and does the rigging and all the rest of it. Um, I mean, major repairs, obviously, they have somebody that does it. They send the boat off to somebody, but the crews do a lot of that, like day to day, looking after the boats and doing their own adjustments and all that. So there's a lot of stress on personal responsibility because they don't have
Yes.
huge amounts of money, uh, and I think that really matures the crew. And when again, the last few years, the thing you notice with Brookes is I can't remember a final at Henley where Brookes have been ahead and lost. So
Right.
I think they've only lost 2 finals out of 15 in the last 2 years. And there they were down pretty much from the start, and they fought really hard but couldn't quite make it. And there were some reasons in certainly one of the cases.
Sure.
Um, but they don't let crews row through them, and
Right.
that's, I think, the psychology. It's
Yes.
like they're sitting in the boat and they say, I know my teammates and I know how they're working flat out, and I know I have to do the same, because you'll know as a rower, if you start doubting your crewmates at any point when you feel like you're going to die,
Right.
um, and you think, well, I'll just have 10 strokes where I take it a bit easy, then that's the end of the race.
Yes.
So
There's
I,
no
and
complacency.
no, and I mean, this year the final of the top Coxless Fours men's events, the Brookes Four had rowed 2 hours earlier in the Grand Cru and beat Washington in the final of the eights.
Oh
And it
my
was a horrible
goodness.
day. It was pouring down. So they came back to the boathouse on a high, soaking wet. They'd sat for an hour before the race. The race was delayed because Washington had a technical problem. Um, so they'd sat out, sat in the rain for an hour before they raced. They came back to the boathouse, soaking wet, no showers, had 2 hours, and then they had to go out and row what was theoretically the best non-Olympic four in the UK, the Leander Four,
Right.
who'd represented GB at the last international regatta a few weeks before Henley. And Brookes were a length and a half down off the start pretty quickly. Um, and in the last 400 meters, they just rode through Leander.
Oh
Went
my.
from they went from a length down to winning by about 3 lengths because Leander just floated over the finishing line. They were absolutely spent.
Oh.
Um, and that was, and I spoke to one of the Brookes crew afterwards, and he said, I don't know how he had the energy. He said, I was screaming at the guy in front, Jake in front of me, don't ease off now. Come on, we've got them, we've got them. So that's the actually that was the youngest guy in the boat who's doing the shouting, who's 20 years old, and he's won 3 Henley medals already. So
Oh my goodness.
he'll be in the LA Olympics. I'd be amazed if he's not in the GB 4 or 8 in the next Olympics.
Uh,
But that's that
well,
team spirit, and that's a great thing about rowing, isn't it? The team thing. I think that's
yes.
what I said to you just before we started. I've just been out to see a friend of mine. I should give him a couple of copies of the book, and he knows nothing about rowing, but his 14-year-old son started rowing at school this year or last year. And absolutely loves it. So my friend Mark is trying to learn about rowing. So I'm talking to him about the benefits of developing that team thing, working with others, collaboration, working hard yourself, but also putting the crew above yourself at times as well, which I think
Yes.
is
Yes.
yeah,
I was, we were talking, and my son, is rowing as well. And one of the things that really struck me that I hadn't thought of before was how much they kind of also, even on a real basic level, look after each other's safety. Like, you
yeah.
know, um, one of the boys came off his seat and his seat popped off, and my son
Oh yeah,
had to help him get back on his seat. And it's almost like this, almost a caretaking or looking out for each other, because
yeah,
it can be actually quite dangerous to be out there if you think about it, with these undeveloped brains in the middle of a big lake, and they
yeah,
do learn quite a bit, and there's a
yeah,
lot of trust and grit
yeah,
and closeness that come from
yeah.
that. But
Well, and you tend to have You tend to have bigger rivers than us in the US as well, don't you? I mean, it's like
Yes.
our rivers are 50 yards wide and yours are 500 yards wide.
They are, they're quite big, and then, Lake Washington can actually get some pretty big whitecaps, so
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's a big one, but, did you want to talk about the Grand? I feel like, I feel like we almost have to talk about the Grand from, this last summer.
Yeah. Well,
What happened there?
yeah. It was. I mean, it was a real shame actually because
Right.
I mean, there were what I think about only about 7 entries, and generally Brookes weren't going to enter the Grand. They were going to put their top
Mm.
boat into the second level event, the intermediate event,
Oh my.
which confusingly is called the Ladies Challenge Plate, but it's
Mhm.
not for ladies; it's for men.
Mhm.
Um, because they had lost at one regatta to Leander, which is the top UK club, not a university but a club. Leander goes back 200 years, so again the Brookes underdog thing comes in whenever they row against Leander. Leander's very
Yes.
very lots of money, very nice people, you know. Um, so so they were concerned that they had lost to Leander. Washington were very strong, so maybe they would enter the ladies and comfortably win that, which I think they would have. And at the last minute, literally the day the entries closed, they had a great training outing, and it was the crew decision. It wasn't the coaches. They got together, and the crew said, "We want to go for the Grand." And the coach said, "Well, you might end up winning nothing, or we might end up winning nothing if we go for the Grand, because then our second boat rows in the Temple, which is the university event. We'll probably win that, but it'll be our third boat in the ladies' plate, so they might not win that. So we could end up only winning one of the three big eights events." And the crew said, "No, we want to go for it." So the two big rivals were Leander and Washington. And Brookes beat Leander on the Saturday semi-final, which was a big race because um, one of the things about the course at Henley, say you row in a marked out course, but two boats side by side, and there is an advantage, particularly if the weather's been bad and there's a lot of water coming down the river. You row against the stream, so the better side to be on is the one nearer the bank where the crowds are.
Right.
Yeah, so that's definitely an advantage. And on the Saturday, Leander had the advantage, but Brookes still managed to beat them. So that was a big race for Brookes. So the
Wow.
Sunday against Washington, Brookes actually had the better side. They had the side nearer the bank. So they were probably more confident actually in the final. So very close off the start, first 2 or 3 minutes. Brookes had a small advantage. And then you come to about just before halfway in the course, because the river bends, but the course is straight. If you can imagine that, there's a
Right.
few hundred yards where actually the other side is nearer the far bank and therefore has less stream to fight against than the near side. So if you were coxing that course on your own without another boat, you'd stay really close to the Berkshire bank for
Right.
the first third of the race. Then you'd go across to the other side for about a quarter of the course, and then you go back to the Berkshire side for the last bit, yeah,
Right. Right. Right.
to minimize the effect of the stream. So, of course, if there's two boats, what you're trying to do is get yourself in the right position and sort of push back a bit if the other crew are trying to get into your water. So it's all very tactical. Anyway, Brookes was slightly ahead, had the advantage of the better station for the first bit of the race. And then they came to the bit where actually Washington would have the advantage.
Right.
And what I think happened as an ex-Cox,
Mhm.
the Washington Cox, who's British, um, steered a bit too dramatically towards the booms, the wooden markers that mark out the course, because
Right.
he was trying to get over towards the bank and minimize the stream. And he just, probably because he was focusing on, they were a little bit behind, not much. Um, Focusing on what Brookes were doing, focusing on trying to get back on terms, steering towards the other bank. He just oversteered.
Right.
And once your bow is pointing towards the booms,
Yes.
um, the problem is at the point you realise that if you steer too dramatically back to trying to be straight again, as your bow comes round and goes back, towards the middle of the course, your stern then swings out towards the booms,
Ah,
and that's what happened.
yes.
So if you look closely at it, it wasn't bow and three that hit the wooden booms. It was the seven man, I think, first of all,
Mhm.
because the stern was swinging round, and now suddenly, the cox is too close to the booms, and the seven man hit them.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so a couple of people said, "Oh well, Brooks pushed them that way," but they didn't.
Mhm.
I mean, Brooks were
Yeah,
edging across towards that side as well, but the boats
right.
were never close together, and it was clearly just the Washington steerage. So I think the odds are 90% Brooks would have won anyway, because they had
Right.
the rest of the race. They had the better side of the course,
Mhm. Mhm.
and as I say, Brooks boats don't tend to give up leads once they're ahead. But but it
Fair.
was it was really, I mean, it was so disappointing, frankly,
Right.
um, because they couldn't get back on terms. And I think I spoke to the Brooks coach afterwards, and he sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, a win's a win, but it's not really how they would have wanted to win it."
Right, you want a
Um,
good match, don't you? You want, like, a
yeah,
good.
and it should have been one of those classic races where Brooks would have come up to the spectator enclosures a length ahead.
Mhm.
Washington would have done a big push.
Yes.
Got back to half a length as they're coming past the crowds. We would all have been going mad on the bank, and then Brooks would have pulled away again, and that's my prediction as to what would have happened. Brooks would have won by three-quarters of a length or something. Um, but instead, the two boats came up three lengths apart. So that was that.
Well,
But,
that goes to show you.
there's been some other great races. Washington actually
Yes.
beat Brooks in the Temple in, oh gosh, I can't remember. It was 21 or 2019, which was a great race. Backwards and
Mhm.
forwards all the way. So it hasn't always been Brooks coming
Well,
out on top.
I'm sure there are still some gentlemen in Seattle that are talking about the 1977 Grand, so where Washington went out for that. So,
70. Oh, hang on, I've
I
got my
believe
list.
it was 77, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah, 77. Yeah, beat. Well, they beat Leander Club and Thames Tradesman, which means that was probably the GB national boat.
Oh
I would
my.
think
Okay.
that would be yeah, that would have been the national squad boat. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah,
we have quite a long history out there. I think that the incentive has always been if you get to a certain level in Washington, you can get the trip out to Henley, but you do have to prove yourself in the States,
yeah,
I think in the past to have gone to Henley. And then of
yeah,
course, um, in the past as well, just like a little historical note, I think that the scheduling of the women's national championship has always in the States has conflicted with the women's Henley.
oh
So
really?
you
Okay,
you wouldn't
yeah,
see Washington women over there as much, but it was a scheduling
no,
issue.
no.
And
Well,
now, of course, you can't they can participate in the Royal Henley with the men sometimes, yeah.
yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, women's Henley was a great innovation, but now there are so many women's events at Henley Royal Regatta. The Henley Women's Regatta has probably dropped a bit in importance. I mean, it's still a great event, but yeah, I've just looked it up. Washington won the Temple, which is the student event in 2018, and beat Brooks in the final. That was the race I was trying to remember. That was a great race.
Okay, I may have to watch that.
Yeah,
Fortunately,
watch
I now have someone in the household that will watch rowing races with me.
that was one of those races where Washington were ahead, and it really looked at a couple of points like Brooks were going to come back and take them, and Washington just gritted it out and won. So
Well,
that
they
that was
probably wanted payback because I believe 2018 was the Windermere Cup where I saw them at the finish line,
okay.
and,
Okay. Yeah.
Brooks came up and they came from behind. Washington still won, but
Mm.
it was by half a canvas maybe. It was
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
close, which I love those close races. I don't know
Oh
about
yeah.
you, but they're amazing. So,
Yeah.
good
No,
fun.
I think the side by side racing, two boats, is almost always more exciting than six lane racing.
Right.
because I think I mean, occasionally, we've had some great Olympic finals, but the six boats, you don't get quite the tension when there's just two, if it's a really close race. Um, and often they're not next to each other, and it's quite hard sometimes in six lane to work out exactly what's going on, the camera angles and everything. But when you get two boats side by side, it's really exciting. So
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, this has been such a wonderful talk, and I didn't even really get a chance to take the time to explore your book, but I feel we covered quite a
we
bit that's
did.
actually in the book.
Yeah, we touched on it. So yeah, so I mean, the book covers the history of books. It goes into some of those key races. I talk about the psychology of books, their recruitment strategy, training, all of those things. I have a bit of a digression as to why Great Britain did so badly in the 2021 Olympics, just because I felt like writing about that.
Right. Sure. Sure. Well, no, I do think I found that actually helpful and interesting. And
Good.
I do also know that you and I kind of have had some similar experiences in that we've probably applied some of our rowing knowledge of, culture and performance and kind of look at our work life and work culture as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I do welcome those because I kind of have had that experience as well. I had originally thought prior to this podcast, I would explore like the good things about rowing culture that you can use in the
Oh,
workplace. And I think
well,
you
we
kind of
do
got into
another one.
that too.
Yeah, yeah. I thought about trying to make the whole thing more of a business book because I thought I
Right.
might sell more copies, but I decided it wasn't a business book. But I've got one chapter towards the end where I try and pull out some of the critical success factors for Brooks and relate it a bit more to other organizations. So, because my career has been in business and a bit of government and so on. So, I've been in that business world, commercial world all my life. So yeah, so maybe we'll do another one looking at
We
that. We can
should.
have a think about that.
I would
Yeah,
enjoy that. I would enjoy
yeah.
that. So, wait, well, I know that we have time commitments after this. So, thank you again so much. And of course, if you ever come out to Seattle, we'll have to talk more in person.
Absolutely. That would be lovely. Thanks for inviting me today. Yeah.
I'm Jen Butler. This is the Third Boat Podcast. Thank you for listening.